Let's get to our meeting about angels and other spiritual beings in the Bible. We will address essential questions that have not been discussed previously, such as, is the powerful angel of Yahweh from the Old Testament Jesus Christ? We will explore who the mysterious Seraphim are, powerful creatures from the spiritual world. In addition, we will question what creatures from the Babylonian and Persian universes have to do with all this, in addition to analyzing whether the prophet Ezekiel really reports a possible contact with an alien civilization. Has this question ever crossed your mind? We will delve deeper into who Metatron is, the enigmatic prince of the presence, and also investigate when angels were created and why the Bible does not directly mention their creation. We will try to explore these and other questions in this part. Previously, we talked about the development of biblical angelology. We focus on the figure of the angel of Yahweh in the times of the First Temple, during the period of the monarchy, before the Babylonian exile. This was the time when the foundations for angelology were being shaped. If you watched the first episode, I suggest you revisit it, and if you haven't yet, I recommend you watch it. In the first part, we discussed the intriguing figure of the angel of Yahweh, who appears in ancient texts of the Bible. This angel of the Lord appears at various times, apparently being God himself in certain passages. The question that arises is this angel God or just a manifestation of God? This question has been raised, but it is a common doubt. Could the angel of Yahweh be Jesus Christ, the pre-incarnate Jesus himself, who appeared, for example, to Moses in the burning bush? This idea, in fact, is not new. This conception already existed in the ancient church. For example, Justin Martyr in the 2nd century and Theodoret of Cyrus in the 5th century identified the angel of Yahweh with the only begotten Son of God, that is, Jesus Christ. Theodoret claimed that the angel of the Lord was the only begotten Son, revealed in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord, who appeared to Abraham, Moses, Gideon, and other biblical heroes. However, this interpretation was challenged by great Christian thinkers such as St. Jerome and St. Augustine. They claimed that although the angel was called the Lord, he was not Jesus, but a divine messenger through whom God spoke directly. As mentioned earlier, in the Old Testament, the angel represented God, since human beings could not see God face to face and survive. Thus, the angel served as an intermediary. The idea that the angel of Yahweh was Jesus before the incarnation was already present in the early centuries of the church. This concept, however, has roots in Jewish traditions, such as the thought of Philo of Alexandria, who identified the angel of Yahweh with the divine logos, the Word of God. Thus, pre-Christian tradition already associated the angel of Yahweh with the incarnate Word of God, which later, in Christianity, was related to Jesus Christ, the logos of God, as we see in the Gospel of John. In the Christian tradition, Jesus is the incarnate Word, and this idea is supported by the concept that the angel of Yahweh in the Old Testament was Jesus himself before his incarnation. This is also reflected in Paul's letters, such as in 1 Corinthians, where he says that the rock from which the Israelites drank in the desert was Christ. However, there is a danger in exaggerating this interpretation, as it is close to the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses, who see Jesus as an angel, specifically the Archangel Michael, before his incarnation and after his ascension. Another interesting point involves the Seraphim, mentioned as spiritual beings of great importance, surrounding the throne of God and associated with divine fire. The word seraph comes from the Hebrew verb meaning to burn, which suggests a connection with fire. However, the Bible does not describe them as angels, since terms such as malachim or angelo are not used to refer to them. Seraphim appear to be a distinct category of spiritual beings. The origins of the concept of seraphim can be traced back to ancient Egypt, where the uraeus, a winged serpent, was a symbol of divine power. This iconography is reflected, for example, in the throne of Tutankhamun, guarded by winged snakes that protected the pharaoh. We can see the connection between this imagery and the figure of the biblical seraphim. The word seraph is also used in the Bible to refer to poisonous serpents, as we see in Numbers 21, where the Israelites are bitten by seraphim. translated as poisonous snakes, which Moses later represented as a bronze serpent. Therefore, Seraph may have become synonymous with the fiery serpent due to the association with its deadly venom. We also find references to these serpents in the book of Isaiah, which mention Seraphim in other contexts, in addition to the famous episode of the vision in the temple. In short, this relationship between fire, serpents, and spiritual beings is a theme that permeates both the Old Testament and, as for the Judeo-Christian tradition, please note that the term Seraphim is used in the sense of something related to flying serpents. In modern Hebrew, the expression ephon kite is also used, although it does not literally mean snake. The term seraph in the book of Isaiah refers to a serpent, the same Isaiah who describes the seraphim around the throne of God. The word seraph is also used to describe a winged serpent in chapter 30 of the book of Isaiah, which strengthens the argument that the term originally refers to snakes. Both in the Bible and in traditions of the ancient East, particularly in Egypt, these serpents, called uraeus, are often depicted as winged snakes. It seems logical to associate this tradition with the seraphim described in Isaiah, which may have originated from the Egyptian uraeus. In fact, there is imagery and archaeological evidence to support this idea. These representations appear not only in Egypt, but also in Israel in the time of Isaiah. Some Israelite seals from the 6th century, for example, show figures of winged snakes, sometimes with 2 pairs of wings, similar to the biblical description of seraphim with multiple pairs of wings. These seals, containing inscriptions in ancient Hebrew, reinforce the cultural connection between the Israelites and the Egyptians, which influenced several aspects, such as the symbols found on these artifacts. The uraeus, with its Egyptian symbolism, also appears on seals from the kingdom of Judah and in Israel. The use of these symbols on Israelite artifacts suggests that Egyptian culture had a significant influence on Israelite symbolism. A clear example is the seal from the 8th century BCE, which shows a winged snake with multiple pairs of wings, very similar to the descriptions of the seraphim in the book of Isaiah. The seraphim in the biblical text are described as having 6 wings, 2 of which cover their faces, 2 cover their feet, and the other 2 they fly with. Although snakes do not have legs, the reference to covering the feet is probably a common euphemism in the Bible to refer to private parts. Therefore, the difference between the seraphim and the uraeus is not so significant in this context. Furthermore, there are representations in Egypt of winged snakes with legs, which may also apply to the seraphim. Other images of uraeus and seraphim, sometimes in humanoid forms, reinforce this connection. Recently, stone seals from the 6th century were discovered in Jerusalem, near the Western Wall, which feature winged figures very similar to the seraphim. These archaeological discoveries show that figures with multiple pairs of wings were known in Israel, reinforcing the idea that Isaiah was referring to cultural representations known in his time. The symbolism of wings and divine figures also appears in relics from other cultures in the region, such as the Neo-Assyrian territory, where figures with 3 pairs of wings, similar to the biblical seraphim, were found. These images are linked to traditions that influenced Isaiah's vision. The descriptions of the seraphim in the book of Isaiah, with 6 wings, covering their faces and legs, and carrying coals from the altar, reinforce the connection between these winged figures and the religious iconography of the time. Isaiah seeks to express his spiritual experience through material comparisons and, apparently, finds these analogies in the Egyptian uraeus. The priest and professor highlights that the interpretations of the seraphim in the book of Isaiah have Egyptian analogies, especially the figure of the uraeus, which is a snake that emerges from the sun, a symbol of protection and destruction that adorns the crown or forehead of the pharaoh. Several finds in Palestine indicate that in the 9th and 8th centuries BC, during the time of Isaiah, representations of the uraeus, both winged and non-winged, were common. In these contexts, the uraeus or seraphim is seen as a being of defense and protection, with its multiple wings emphasizing its power. Thus Isaiah, in his vision, elevates these images, sublimating the worship of divinities and subordinating these beings to Yahweh, who occupies the supreme throne. The seraphim worship the holiness of the invisible God, revealing a clear tendency to subordinate these spiritual entities to God himself. It is important to remember that at this time, they are not yet considered angels. This classification would only be established later in Christian theology, which sought to integrate these spiritual figures into the concept of angels. It is interesting to note that in the Bible, angels are not described as having wings, a characteristic that is often attributed to seraphim or cherubim. These beings are not related to the biblical angels, who are sent by God on specific missions. The scene that Isaiah witnesses, that of the divine throne, is one of great impact, and this representation of God's holiness has influenced not only literature and art, but also liturgy, contributing to our understanding of heaven and heavenly worship. The seraphim, protagonists of this liturgy, have 6 wings. 2 cover the face, 2 cover the legs, and the other 2 are used for flying. These beings, therefore, do not seek glory for themselves, but for God, exalting his holiness and proclaiming divine glory. From this vision, 2 main functions of the seraphim emerge. The first is purification, since they do not allow anything impure to come near God. The verb seraph is often associated with burning impurities, a fundamental task for preserving holiness. The second role is worship, where the seraphim form a circle around God, expressing a deep love and reverence, glorifying him incessantly. These celestial beings are therefore central to an eternal liturgy, where their cry for holiness enriches the worship of God. In addition, we must consider the enigmatic figure of Metatron, described as the prince of the presence who occupies the throne next to God. Metatron, who is not mentioned in the Bible, appears in biblical literature and rabbinic tradition, especially in the 3rd book of Enoch. He is seen as the highest of the seraphim, next to God, identified as a divine scribe responsible for recording the divine words. The origin of the name Metatron remains a mystery, with several etymologies proposed, but one interpretation suggests that it relates to the idea of guarding, a function similar to that of the seraphim who act as guardians. When praising God, it is possible to associate Metatron with the figure who guards, and some traditions link this word to the ancient Persian sun god Mitra, leading to the notion of Mithraism, a Persian religion. Others claim that the origin of the term may be a combination of Greek words, where meta means after, and thrones refers to throne. This suggests that Metatron would be the one who serves behind the throne of God or who occupies a throne beside it. In biblical texts, Metatron is often identified as Enoch or even as Prince Michael, the archangel. There are references that indicate that he will descend to earth incarnate and assume the form of the Messiah. Thus, it is intriguing to note that in these texts, Metatron does not merely stand before God, but actually occupies a throne next to him. This idea of Metatron's creation, even before the light and everything else, is addressed in the Talmud, especially in the tractate Haggadah. In addition, there are mentions of an ancient Jewish sage, Elisha ben Avua, who would have seen Metatron in the sky seated, leading to the conclusion of his quasi-divine status as a messianic figure who will descend to earth and incarnate, similar to the figure of Jesus. Metatron is described as the divine scribe, the Logos, the one who sits beside God and does not remain standing. This mysterious figure is both an angel and a representation of Enoch, with texts suggesting that he will return to earth. Metatron has generated many questions and is a popular character in contemporary culture, appearing in books, films, games, and anime. Although his figure has biblical roots, he was already present in literature between the Testaments, where he is recognized as the leader of the seraphim. However, in later Jewish and Christian texts, Metatron assumes a very important role. Now, let's move on to another equally relevant subject, focusing on an important spiritual figure described in the Bible, the cherubim. These beings are seen as guardians of the throne of Yahweh, often associated with an erroneous image of small angels with wings, which originates more from the Greek tradition. In Greek culture, these small beings are known as Putos and refer to Eros, the god of love. On the other hand, in the Bible, the cherubim are portrayed as formidable protectors of the throne of God. There are several descriptions of these sacred beings in Scripture, which differ in some details, such as the number of faces. The earliest description of cherubim is in the first book of Kings, chapter 6, which narrates the construction of the temple in Jerusalem by Solomon. In the Holy of Holies, where only the Ark of the Covenant remained as the throne of God, Solomon was to make 2 cherubim of olive wood, each about 5 meters high. The wings of these cherubim were to extend equally, reaching the same height. When placed at the back of the temple, their wings touched the side walls. It is interesting to note that the author focuses more on the wings of the cherubim than on their appearance. These wings are essential, as they create a kind of invisible throne for God, which was to be adorned with gold. The earliest description of cherubim also appears in Ezekiel during the period of the Babylonian captivity. It is crucial to emphasize this context as it relates to imagery from Babylonian culture. In his inaugural vision, Ezekiel describes the cherubim as human, but with 4 faces, in contrast to other descriptions that present only 1 or 2 faces. Each has straight legs, bull-like feet, and 4 wings, creating a hybrid image. The reference to atro faces, each with the face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, refer to creatures present in Mesopotamian culture, especially in Akkad and the Babylonian Empire. These hybrid beings, called Lamassu, have their origins in Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. The term cherub is a loan word from the Akkadian Cherubim. In Assyrian art, Lamassu are represented with parts of bulls or lions and human faces. These monumental sculptures symbolize the guardians of thrones. It is noted that the Bible describes 2 cherubim in the temple, in the same way that Lamassu guarded the entrance to palaces and temples. Finally, in the imagination of the construction of Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies should contain not only the Ark of the Covenant, but also the cherubim carved in gold, thus forming a sacred environment for the divine presence. Holy of Holies. Why are there so many representations of cherubim around the throne of God? Let's explore this further. First, look at the temple in Jerusalem and some of its images. We can also talk about Eastern iconography, or the tetramorph, which seeks to represent 4 faces, that of a man, an ox, an eagle, and a lion. The engraving of the Ark of the Covenant also illustrates these figures. In the Holy of Holies, we find the Ark, where a high priest, wearing a pectoral cross, appears to be bowing. This is not a biblical scene, because in the Bible the high priest does not behave in this way, but it reflects a more Christian image, similar to that of the priests of the Old Testament who bowed before the ark. In it, there were 2 cherubim carved in gold, who looked at each other. And we can go back to analyzing the biblical description, where it is mentioned that Moses should forge 2 golden wings for the mercy seat of the Arkansas. The wings open upwards, covering the faces of the cherubim, who look at each other and at the mercy seat, as if they were ashamed to raise their eyes to what is in their midst. The wings of the cherubim are above them, for above them is the throne of the invisible God. They seem to bow down, looking down at the ground and at themselves, avoiding looking at the divinity that is between their wings. I will show this more clearly shortly. The book of Exodus describes how Moses must place the tablet of atonement in the ark, where the cherubim must be, who bow down with great humility, for between their wings dwells the Shekinah, the presence of God. I have here a teaching resource that I use to show students the Ark of the Covenant, where we can clearly see the cherubim and how their wings create a throne for the invisible presence of God. In the Bible, we often have descriptions that confirm this. I refer you to my book Sanctuary of Glory, where I analyze in detail the texts that speak of God's communication with Moses and other heroes. The word cherub that we find in the Bible is undoubtedly derived from the imagery of winged figures from Babylon, and I will soon present quotes from scholars that corroborate this connection. The representations of cherubim that emerged during the Babylonian captivity are clearly influenced by Mesopotamian cultures, such as Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian. Among these images are the Lamassus, who were guardians of palaces, as in the palace of Sargon II. These figures, with the torso of a lion or bull, have a human face and often wear a crown, symbolizing wisdom. When looking at the entrance to Sargon's palace, we notice that there are lamasses, winged beings that protected the entrance to the palace of the great king. On the wings of a lamassus, we find an inscription mentioning Hezekiah, an important king in the Bible who ruled under the prophet Isaiah. This is confirmation of the presence of King Hezekiah in historical context. In the Louvre, we can see examples of lamassus, which can measure about 3 meters in height. The term cherub is derived from the Akkadian Cherubim, and it is interesting to note that these protective beings, called lama or shadu, initially appeared as guardians of individuals and later became guardians of royal thrones and temples. These hybrid creatures not only symbolize power, but also transcend the physical world. The idea that wings are not necessary for flying, but represent a connection with the supernatural world, is recurrent in several ancient cultures. Lamassus, therefore, exhibit a terrifying appearance, combining characteristics of lions, bulls, humans, and birds to convey a sense of power. The presence of these immense and imposing sculptures would make anyone entering a palace or temple feel a certain fear. I recently found an old postcard that showed how these sculptures were transported to Europe, evidencing their weight and grandeur. These examples can be found in several museums in Europe, especially in countries that brought these relics from the East, such as Great Britain, Germany, France, and Italy. The Louvre Museum and the Pergamon in Berlin has many such representations. For example, in the Iraqi National Museum in Baghdad, we can see powerful figures of lamassus. In Persepolis, there are also representations of cherubim guarding important entrances, revealing a continuity in iconography throughout history. These sculptures, which date from around 2000 BC, show how the idea of protective beings evolved over time. The lama, originally a protective spirit, later became a guardian of the thrones of the royal gods. In Megiddo, an ivory sculpture shows the king on his throne with a winged figure at his side. The Neo-Assyrian bas-relief, dating from around 1000 BC, also illustrates these winged creatures. Therefore, these representations of lamassus and cherubim that we find in the Bible reflect a borrowing of ideas from Mesopotamian culture, where these spiritual beings appear as guardians of important entrances. The Bible describes the divine presence associated with cherubim, which are mentioned 92 times in the Old Testament and once in the New Testament. This presence manifests itself not only in the Ark of the Covenant, but also in the curtains and walls of the Holy of Holies, reinforcing the connection between the angelic figures and the divinity that inhabited this sacred space. We can say that God has imagination and should not be restricted. The beings described in the Bible as chubas are representations of winged entities, which refer to an ancient iconography of hybrids. These creatures, which captured the attention of the peoples of the ancient Middle East, were seen as dangerous and fascinating. Their wings symbolized a supernatural origin, representing what was spiritual and divine. Thus, the biblical chubas are closely linked to the Akkadian cherubim, as the etymology is the same, deriving from the term caribou, whose statues guarded the palaces of Babylon. In the Temple of Jerusalem, especially at the door of the Holy of Holies, these figures had the function of maintaining the connection with the divine presence. Similar statuettes have been found in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Syria. The presence of cherubim in the Bible occurs in contexts where God reveals himself in majesty, as can be seen in Catholic iconography that highlights the eternal lamp in the church, symbolizing the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. Interestingly, Israeli law prohibited the creation of images that offended God, but the chubas represented an exception, evidencing divine protection. There are several theories about the origin of the idea of cherubim before this prohibition. Some believe that this exception in worship was linked to the demonstration of the power of beings that guard the invisible presence of God, who, although not visible, was represented by the Ark and the chubas. William Foxwell Albright, one of the leading archaeologists of the 20th century, stated that winged lions with human heads, found in Phoenicia and Canaan, were more common than other winged creatures and were clearly associated with cherubim. These beings symbolized the holiness and mystery of God's presence, occupying a central role in Israelite worship alongside the ark. In addition, in several biblical verses, God is described as the one who dwells between the cherubim. Psalm 99, for example, mentions that Yahweh reigns over the cherubim, evidencing the idea that these beings evoke respect and fear, while announcing the direct presence of God. The four faces mentioned in Ezekiel resemble the Christian iconography of the four evangelists, each symbolizing different aspects. However, there are questions about the vision of the cherubim in Ezekiel, especially with regard to the possibility that this vision may describe the landing of a spaceship on Earth. This interpretation was popularized by Erich von Däniken, who suggested that the description of extraordinary phenomena in the Bible, such as God's revelation on Mount Sinai, could resemble the landing of a spaceship. For example, Ezekiel describes an impressive vision of a storm and a great cloud in which four living creatures appear. The description includes elements such as fire, moving wheels, and strangely shaped objects, leading to speculation that Ezekiel was reporting an experience of contact with advanced technology. This interpretation suggests that the ancient biblical authors, unfamiliar with modern techniques, attempted to describe phenomena using the language and imagination available to them at the time. The claim that there is a spaceship on Earth is thoroughly discredited by three arguments that I will discuss. These arguments are based on ideas presented by Erich von Däniken and others. First, by attempting to interpret certain biblical descriptions as evidence of ancient astronauts, it is suggested that these extraterrestrials made multiple visits to our planet. However, the Bible consistently presents the vision of spacecraft on Earth, or of the throne of God, using familiar elements. For example, Ezekiel, when describing the divine throne, does not use new vocabulary or images, but rather familiar symbols, which are part of the cultural tradition of the ancient Near East. Therefore, the images that Ezekiel uses to portray the throne of God are not related to the landing of a spaceship, but rather to typical visions of celestial realities, as well as works of art from antiquity that depict thrones, whether divine or human, with similar elements. Secondly, we have no conclusive scientific evidence that proves the existence of voices or extraterrestrial intelligence, much less the landing of a spaceship here. This notion that aliens are contacting us or want to explore Earth is an outdated idea that originated in the early 20th century, when it was believed that an alien civilization could actually contact us. Today, we know that civilizations much more advanced than ours would not need to physically approach, but could send signals without having to come in person. This idea of direct physical contact with an alien civilization is so archaic that it almost seems ridiculous. Therefore, claiming that the Bible contains descriptions of spacecraft landings is something that should be considered as mere fiction. Finally, it is important to address the issue of spiritual beings mentioned in the Bible, such as the Seraphim and Cherubim. Seraphim are described as the highest category of beings who protect the throne of God. This category includes creatures known as Anim, which are angels associated with the throne. While many have heard of Seraphim and Cherubim, mention of Anim is less well known, although it has been referenced in biblical studies. Returning to the book of Ezekiel, specifically in the chapters that speak of the visions he had, we find intriguing descriptions of living beings and wheels that seem to have a divine purpose. The wheels are described as living creatures, full of eyes, that move in perfect harmony with the beings that are with them. Ezekiel portrays these beings in a way that we can interpret them not as machines, but as living spiritual entities. Representations of these visions vary in ancient art, showing the difficulty of visualizing what Ezekiel saw. The wheels are interpreted as living beings, each with its own spirit, and this description evokes a rich visual tradition that extends throughout history. In addition, Daniel, in his visions, also refers to beings and wheels that are associated with the throne of God, which aligns with Ezekiel's vision. Both prophets share the idea that the divine throne is supported by beings that are not merely static, but rather living entities that express the power and glory of God. In ancient literature, especially in texts such as the Book of Enoch, the Anim are mentioned as a separate category of spiritual beings that guard the throne of God, along with the Seraphim and Cherubim. This relationship extends to the Christian tradition, where thrones are considered a symbol of the divine presence. Paul, in his letters, also mentions celestial beings and alludes to this rich spiritual hierarchy, linking the creation of all things to Jesus Christ. In his description, Paul speaks of heavenly thrones and authorities, reinforcing the idea that there is a complex structure of beings that involve the presence of God. In short, this lecture aims to expand our understanding of angels and spiritual beings in the biblical tradition, revealing that these beings are much more complex and rich than the simplistic view we often have. In the next part, we will address the evolution of the idea of angels throughout history, and we will also discuss demonology, exploring topics such as Lucifer and the fallen angels. I hope this discussion contributes to a deeper understanding of the vast spiritual world that surrounds us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to receive more biblical stories and teachings. May God's blessings be with you. Comment below what you thought of the story and share your thoughts. See you in the next video.